Okay, different voice. Different computer, different voice. Okay, so today we're focusing on purifying negative actions, given that the Buddha said any negativity that we have done can be purified. So, in other words, we don't have to wait for the regrettable, action or speech to ripen in some future suffering for ourselves. We can actually purify it, be rid of it, which is because the mind, everything's impermanent, subject to change. So we have this, if people have the notes, we're on page 8, this quote from Arya Nagarjuna, letter to a friend. So that was to King, about advice for practice. And it's a classic text that we study to this day. So this quote, anyone who previously didn't care and later develops a caring attitude, in other words, didn't have a clue about karma and its consequences, and then really gets very concerned about that, maybe like us, becomes as beautiful as the moon when parted from the clouds. As the moon when parted from the clouds. So we can think of the, full moon, or even 1,000 full moons, why not, in the autumn sky, that's just, completely brilliant. Like Nanda and Gulimala and Vishastru and Uddiyana. So these four, Nanda was half brother. We always have these inspiring stories. So Nanda was a half brother of the Buddha, because the Buddha's mother passed away a week after he was born and went to Shida heaven, God realm of the 33. And so this was a younger half brother. And so he had fallen in love with a drop-dead gorgeous woman, apparently, at least to his eyes, right? And but then he ordained, and he didn't, he couldn't get her out of his mind. And so he was always like yearning for that. And so the Buddha took him up to a pure land, and he saw all the beautiful dakinis and goddesses in the pure land, looking, 1,000 times more beautiful than the woman he was lusting after. So then he thought, okay, I'm going to practice really hard so that, and I can have all these things in the pure land. And the other monks would be ribbing him because it wasn't exactly a pure motivation. But he continued to practice diligently, and of course, what happened? Then he really developed renunciation from his practice. So even his motivation wasn't pure. It's a good story for us that he was able to reach the state where he completely develop renunciation, let go of 8 worldly concerns, no more interested in women and whatever. So whatever was causing him attachment to this world. And at that point he attained arhatship, which meant at that point he had a direct realization of emptiness, and overcame all the afflictions, and the rest is history. And Gulimala was also, these were at the time of the Buddha. And Gulimala was had gone, to a wrong teacher, shall we say, who he followed the advice. I don't think any of us would follow this advice. Maybe he didn't have much wisdom. And the advice, he had to kill 1,000 people. And he's called Angulimala because mala, like the mala, so like a rosary that he wore around his waist, of all the thumbs that he took as trophies from each one of his victims. And he'd got to 999, and he'd sort of ambushed people on the road. And I don't know what the legal system was like back then, but this is how the story goes. And so then number 1000 was the Buddha, right? The Buddha came along, and so he's chasing after the Buddha, and he can't catch up with the Buddha, and he's like, "Why are you running away? Why are you running away?" And the Buddha actually stopped and said, "I stopped running away, eons ago. I'm running away from, afflictions and so forth and whatever." And that was the teaching that Angulimala needed. He prostrated to the Buddha, and that did the deed. I mean, he had the karma to meet the Buddha. So yes, he had heavy negative karma, but he had the karma to see the Buddha. And we say that we're obscured from that by all our obscurations. So he did have the karma to do that, to meet the Buddha and then directly become a disciple of the Buddha. So happy story in the end. And this was later on. So no, this was at the time of the Buddha. Ajatasattu was the son of King Bimbisara. King Bimbisara was a great devotee of the Buddha. And anyway, so his son wants to take over the rule of the kingdom. So imprisons him and is planning to kill him. And then, expand his own kingdom. So when he first encountered the Buddha, again, he realized the error of his ways and that he'd been following Devadatta, the jealous cousin of the Buddha, who was jealous because the Buddha got all the followings and he didn't get. And also realized that the fault of his plan to kill his own father. So he quickly took refuge in the Buddha and became a strong devotee himself. And then at the time of the Buddha's death, he erected a stupa there with over the bones and ashes of the Buddha. And he was a sponsor and present at the first Buddhist council, so the first 500 who achieved hardship in the first Buddhist council after the Buddha had passed away. So that was at Rajagriha at the Satapatthana caves. And if anyone's been there, as you go up the hill, there's caves. And I remember going in there and doing practices on the way up to Vulture's Peak. And so it was there. That's what it meant. So there you go. Another good story. In the end, turned out good. And Udayana was a great womanizer and warrior. And he was influenced by one of his women, his consorts, to kill his wife, or at least attack her. But I think he was attempting to shoot his wife with that arrow. And so he shot the arrow, and the arrow circled around her 3 times and came back to him. As the bit boomerang, isn't it? Early boomerang. And then she said to him that she was a follower of the Buddha and that perhaps he should follow the Buddha as well. And she urged him to do that. And so he went to see the Buddha and received the teachings. And then when the Buddha went up to Shida heaven to teach his mother, who had passed away a week after he was born, so he was really distressed because he didn't have the teachings from the Buddha. And it said that he had made the first image of the Buddha. It was out of sandalwood, human, life-size image of the Buddha. So clearly mended his ways as well. So there's many, many stories to inspire us. We haven't been perhaps quite so bad in this life. We can reassure ourselves that, well, I didn't do that, I wasn't a Milarepa, right?
Sounds like dentistry, doesn't
it? Yeah, we could make a few great movies out of this. Actually, I haven't seen it because one of our Buddhist students at Chenrezig Institute, and she was also the doctor for all the sons. We went to her place one time, and her and her husband were really taken with this. I think it was like 40 plus episodes from the time of the Buddha. all these stories, but it was done in that sort of Indian, not quite Bollywood, but a bit, was like, it was a bit like Dynasty, you know, Bollywood style. And like, yeah, it doesn't really grab me. But perhaps they had these stories in there. No doubt they did. Okay. Alrighty, so last time we were talking a little bit, and I just wanted to go over a bit more about the karmic weight of deeds. So here we have in terms of, you know, what the unwholesome or negative actions, and we've gone through those previously. So that actions motivated by our toxic emotions, if you like, I mean, greed, attachment, hatred, delusion, attachment, greed or attachment, same thing, hatred or revenge, anger, all of that. And then delusion, our confused states of mind, which we usually say the root ignorance, the three poisons and all the other afflictions that come out of this. So then we have the 10 non-virtuous actions, which we have gone through. So we don't need to go over those again. Killing, stealing, sexual misconduct, lying, harsh speech, slander, gossip, covetousness, jealousy, malice, and wrong view. So we looked at that in terms of motivation for engaging in these types of action. But just to dwell a little bit more on the differences in relation to karmic weight of non-virtuous actions. So the weightiness of it, in other words, the heaviness, the strength of that non-virtue depends on a few different factors. And one of those is the object. So say the object of our action is someone who is sick or helpless. So then the non-virtue is greater than if it's somebody who's, say, healthy and not helpless. So, for example, we can say that, you know, I found this with my mother when I was caring for my mother towards the end of her life, and then she was in respite care. And so there would be these people who'd ring up the elderly and try and con money out of them, or con whatever, swindle them out of their savings. So this is said to be a heavier negative karma than if you were involved in a dishonest scheme to dupe a group of business people or an organisation. Interesting, isn't it? Because we do say it's about, you know, that thing of stealing. Well, that's also lying. It's deceit plus stealing. Something that's of value to the person. So that's why it's heavier if we're assuming that those business people are wealthy, and it's not as heavy karma. Doesn't condone it, but just sort of looking at the weight of that. And then, of course, anything in relation to our gurus is the heaviest negative karma. For example, lying to the guru and saying, oh yes, I've been doing those practices. Well, I remember one of the geshes who'd given the group of people a commitment to do, and then one day asked, now, are you all doing that practice? Yes, Geshe-la. And I would have to say that group of people are just sort of, without wanting to stereotype, but a group of very devoted Vietnamese students. And as far as I could see, they were absolutely 100% truthful, you know, that they really took those practices to heart. But if you were lying about that, that would be a heavy negative karma, because you want to look good in front of the guru. And that sort of thing, unfortunately, does happen where people want to look good. It's pointless because they know our minds. So there's no point whatsoever. But it also creates the condition that we may be then separated from our gurus and even from the Dharma. So we have to be very, very careful about that sort of thing. Or using harsh words or being abusive or angry towards a dying parent. So a parent, our gurus, they're very heavy objects of karma, karmic actions, karmic deeds. Our parents gave us this life. If nothing else, they gave us this life. Even if we think, well, I've never had a good relationship with them, then still, you know, and when they're in the process of dying, why is that so much important? Because how your mind is at the time of death determines your throwing karma for the next life. So it's going to have a big influence on you. Yeah, so it's much greater than, say, telling a teenager off for being untidy. That's sort of like pales in comparison, doesn't it? Yeah. I was thinking another thing that comes out into that is frequency. I'm thinking of the teenager. Actually, I'm thinking of myself as a teenager. And then the subject, in other words, the person doing that. So say as an ordained person, as a Sangha member, engaging in any of the non-virtues is much heavier than a lay person doing that. Why? Because having taken more vows, you know. So yeah, if you break them inappropriately, it's much heavier than lay people, as I said. And then people who are in roles of responsibilities, for example, on a mundane level, people who hold public office, teachers and so forth, if they engage in negative karma and break trust to non-virtuous actions, that has a heavy consequence. You know, you've got a whole classroom, or public servants can influence a whole lot of people, and so that has, yeah, they've got a greater responsibility. And I have to say, these days we have to include people like sports people. If we see that sports people, it's interesting, isn't it, that they're held to a great account, right? And suddenly we find out all the naughty things they do, you know, if they, and then they, yeah, suffer serious mundane consequences, but you'd say the karmic, because of the influence of those people. So dependent on the amount of influence that you have. And then, of course, we did talk previously about the motivation, the strength of your motivation. So if it's dominated by hatred, anger, and so forth, it's going to influence the weight of that karmic action. If we say we, you know, sort of automatically without thinking see a spider in the bath, if you have a bath, or in the shower, they seem to love going to showers, spiders. I always think, now, if I just turn the water on a little bit, maybe they'll crawl up. It seems to work. It seems to work that they really want to, you know, survival mechanism kicks in, and they're like, no, I don't want to shower, thanks. But anyway, that's into the shower. I suppose they're looking for water. But if you kill them even mindlessly, that has a much lighter negative fallout than, you know, vengefully smashing the spider, yeah, whatever, viciously. And then we have situations, if you think that the situation now, like in Ukraine, Russia, and everyone else affected by that war, where you see, you know, that people to stay alive would be forced to steal food or other things to survive. And it certainly creates negative karma, but the weight of that is less than other people who take out of greed and loot empty buildings. We see that sometimes with the floods and so forth, and that it's not, I mean, they might be doing it for survival, which means that it's a lesser thing, but if they're doing it for their own personal gain, that's what they do. In other words, be very careful. And then another thing to consider is the action itself, the way in which the action is undertaken. So first of all, it's about how we feel about that non-virtuous action. So we see in the example of the Ukraine-Russia war, where the Russians may be killing people, but they don't want to. They're repulsed by it, and you've even seen some of them just going AWOL, quitting their army, saying, I'm not going to get involved with this. I actually heard somewhere that a lot of people in that war situation aim to miss, right? If you've got to shoot, but they don't want to kill people. So that, and I think particularly the volunteers who haven't had their minds, you know, sort of trained to become killing machines and desensitized and so forth, very, very difficult. Of course, it produces negative karma, but it's very different than if you were killing with, you know, a mind of revenge, where you might be doing it totally numb because you're in shock that you're doing it. So that's less karma, less heaviness, less weight. Yeah. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche also used the example at the time of the Taliban, and that we could say the same thing about maybe not the ordinary everyday Russians, but if, say, Putin was injured or so forth, we've got to be careful not to rejoice in that, think, oh, great, you know. So even it's said that simply by rejoicing is equivalent to killing 1,000 human beings. So no rejoicing in there. It's very hard, that one, I think. We can feel perhaps relief that if he's been put out of action, we're not willing for him to be killed or anything, but if he's made not to be able to act with that influence, so forth, that would be a good, and think that's a good thing for the world, but not rejoicing, think, oh, great, now, yeah. We have to be very, very careful.
On that note, I find it just really interesting because I think that's so often how the term karma is used.
Yeah.
So the irony of people who may not necessarily know that, you know, like you see stories of cars, you know, doing silly things on the road and then they get picked up by the police and they go, oh, that's their karma. And people are rejoicing.
Yeah.
Someone's
They got caught.
And so
yeah.
just even so they're rejoicing in it and they're using that as a demonstration of karma. Yet that whole act creates is a heavy karma in itself. So
correct.
The irony of how it's used in the West.
Yeah. So you've got the wrong rejoicing, as Rinpoche calls it, plus you've also got that mind of ignorance saying it's karma without understanding karma. And you wouldn't know that that's their karma. I mean, we can say every moment of breathing is our karma. But yeah, when it's used in that negative way, so it's also reinforcing the ignorant confusion of our mind, the deluded states of mind. So that's what they're not realizing, because there's that arrogance that comes along with it. Like thinking, I'm okay, excuse me, and just looking at actually created a whole lot of negative karma for myself. And whoever heard me, if they believe me, then that's had a greater impact as well. Yeah. Yeah.
Still not understanding what karma seems to be more like justice.
It's more like punishment. Punishment.
Something bad, something bad happens to them, but karma isn't judging. It's just done something.
It's cause and effect, cause and effect. Yeah. And it can be terrible things, and that's where people personally, if they don't understand, can feel like, why am I being punished for this? You know, I didn't do blah, blah, blah. And they'd be right if they're talking about this lifetime. Yeah. So we have to be very careful to use, probably not, best not to use that word. Even when people ask, I'm very reluctant to say, what's the karma of that? You know, I had a friend who was chronically, and probably still is, I'm not in touch with her these days, chronically, physically. She's bipolar as well as chronic fatigue and bedridden basically, and was getting worse. And she felt like she said, I'm living a quarter of a life or something. I mean, you couldn't say, oh no, you're living a vibrant, healthy, full life, because that wasn't true. And she'd say, well, what's my karma? And I wasn't about to say, you know, oh, well, you know, you've done all of this in previous lives. You must have killed people because, you know, it's affecting you, having chronic illness, and maybe it shortens your life and so forth. You wouldn't dare say anything like that, because how do we know anyway? But, you know, I just would turn her mind, and this was very truthfully, to the fact that you are such a loving, kind person to so many people, and so many people rely on you, not to mention all the dogs that she just loved dogs. Spoiled dogs, not to mention all the spoiled dogs. I was more worried about that. She'll come back as a dog. But, you know, you just sort of turn your mind to the positive, yeah, that we can see in others. Helps us overcome that for ourselves. And then the frequency, how often we engage in, say, you know, that repeated negative action. And so, you know, so I'm looking at the war situation again, that people may become desensitized and used to that killing, and then it becomes inconsequential, and you're sort of doing it again and again. And so that increases the weight of that because of the frequency. So anything that we would do, you know, sometimes, you know, habits build easily. It seems like you do it once, it's easier. Well, you know, I'm having the experience of visiting people in prison, I can say, you know, just sort of got easier for me, you know, when I was in an environment with other people who are doing the same thing, so that becomes your reality, and just like break into another bank or another one or whatever, yeah. So that becomes heavier. And the lack of, it's called lack of opponent. In other words, what we call, coming up to the 4 opponent powers, that we have ways to remedy the situation. And so that by not engaging in an opposing state of mind or opposing action to purify, having no remorse. And even in a court of law, that gives you a heavier penalty if you have no remorse for the act that you did. So societally, it's accepted as heavier by having no remorse after the fact. Of course, and then so in terms of karma, the same thing, but that we have these 4 opponent powers, we have remedies, we have many different ways that we can engage in purification practices to, you know, and the heavier the purification practice, the more we are able to burn off all those karmic imprints, the tendency to do again, or the toxicity in our mind, and so forth. Okay. Any comments, questions? All right. Okay, so the next thing in that outline is the results of their actions. So we looked previously at the motivation, engaging in the deed, and the completion of the deed. But we have these 4 results, fruition of the, so the fruitional result, the rebirth from engaging in non-virtue without having purified. So just take these as a given without having purified, that we end up in lower realms. Depending on the heaviness, the heaviest thing is to end up with in the hottest hell of Avicii, which it said that, you know, tiny who's got a thing? A tiny fire spark of a being in that hell realm, just one tiny fire spark, is greater than all the fire systems of this world system. So that's the intensity of it, of all, you know, conflagrations, bushfires, everything piled into one is far greater, you know, this tiny fire spark. so that it's intense suffering. We can read about the hell realms. Lama Zopa Rinpoche, when he would run the Kopan courses early on with Lama Yeshe, would be go out of 3 weeks out of 4 would be on the hell realms, and people just like, you've got to be joking, I'm out of here. Is this what you're offering me? And Lama Yeshe somehow would buoy people up and keep them there. So yeah, pretty intense suffering. So from all of these, it's going to be a result of rebirth in one of the lower realms. And so that would depend on what we've just looked at, the heavy weightiness, the heaviness of the karma. And it says causally concordant behavioral result. So the result of repeating those same non-virtuous actions. So that, in other words, when we see the Putins or the previously Hitlers of the world, it brings, it's like, okay, they have been habituated to being killing machines and unfortunately causing a lot of other people to kill. You'd say, well, they're not really killers because they're not doing the killing themselves. But it's a double whammy because you're causing others to kill. So you've got the act of killing plus causing others. And so somehow even your people, let's not go so, such a magnitude, world impact, even people who have the tendency to kill other living beings. When I was growing up, there was a family next door who, let's say the mother wasn't doing good mothering and the kids were getting away with a whole lot of bad behaviour, and maybe it was learned behaviour. So, for example, I remember one time a couple of the kids breaking into our house, and my mother said they got a hiding for that, but she suspected it was because they got caught, not because they did it. And that might have been true, but unfortunately, this is not a nice situation. So they, a couple of the boys, they'd put firecrackers up the bottoms of cats. I'm just saying, pretty gross, right? So that's causing unbearable suffering. And not just for the cats either, I'm just like thinking about it now as a matter, and what would cause somebody to engage in such behaviour. And it said that, and certainly from the work in the prison systems, that often people, go from killing animals to killing humans. That can happen. And that's, an unfortunate condition. So you could say that could be also a result of previous lives as humans engaging in killing. So, yeah. So then it makes it harder to engage in virtue, opportunities to go engage in virtue. So through the prison project, I know that a number of people, when they're being released from prison, have said, can you find a monastery for me, a retreat place? I feel like I'm a danger to the world. And so they knew that their minds were disturbed, and that was so hard, even though they had tried to overcome that. So it makes it much harder than with our minds. And then the causally concordant experiential result, you experience similar unpleasant events yourself in accordance with that action. So when again born human, you might be then having chronic illness, your life is shortened. So you experience that sort of result yourself. And the environmental result of being an unpleasant place to live. You might be reborn into a war zone, for example. This is, again, we've got to just think all the time. This is not a blame game. It's a cause and effect. And it's so hard to step away from the blame game, because it's like, well, Ukraine didn't ask to be invaded. And we can go, nor did Indigenous Australians ask to be taken on board, etc., etc., etc. So what we can say there, there is karma involved with this. So just yeah. Oh yeah. So some examples here. I won't go through them all because there's a lot, but just to give a sense of that. So the action of killing, seeing we're on that. Okay, rebirth in a lower realm. Later, and it's like later in a human rebirth. So if you was a human killing, we're talking about the karma that ripens when again born human. So that could be any number of intervening lives, especially if you go to hell realms for eons. So what happens in that time? The karmic fallout multiplies. And so you know, as I said, have a short life, ill health, many troubles, no success in your activities. In other words, you're not able to reap the results of any virtuous karma that you also have on the mental continuum. It's not strong enough. You have a habitual desire to kill and harm others. Very interesting. You know, I'm so relieved that when I was growing up, and initially we were in this, what was a small town, it's slightly bigger today, anyway, we're down by the river, and I'd go with my brothers fishing, right? I never caught a thing. And then even later, when with a friend, I went fishing, I never caught a thing. So I was a failure at fishing. I am so relieved. Now that I've met the Dharma, I was like, yes! Something was protecting me. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm just trying to work out about, like, just with the karmic results of killing, and then being reborn into lower realms.
Yeah.
How would you then? How is it possible to get out of that cycle if you then have less of an opportunity to?
It's very, very, very hard, which is why you go to those lower realms for eons, right? Particularly the hell realms. Fortunately, we have all these Buddhas who've made great aspirations for the sake of sentient beings, like Kshitigarbha going to the hell realms and so forth. So there are stories of the Buddha being in the hell realm, just that one act of compassion, and they say even for the sake of one sentient being to go and abide in those realms, in Arya Bodhisattvas and so forth. So that, and this is why also in terms of the animal realm has a lot more, shall we say, opportunity through, especially if they end up as pets of us Dharma practitioners, to hear the Dharma, even they can't make sense of it, to see in holy images, even they can't make the sense of it, but somehow that puts an imprint in the mental continuum that will ripen in future lives. So, you know, you hear the story of this one was a bird that, you know, heard the great practitioners practice, and, you know, the recitation of sutra and so forth, and in the next life born human was a great scholar. Wow. Maybe that bird life was just burning off one last thing before progressing on the path. So, you know, we can only speculate. But yeah, that's why we take any opportunity, and we visualize beings in the hell realms, we visualize beings in the preta realm. Even we can't see them, but we have descriptions of those. And, you know, when we offer food, and we offer for their benefit, right? If we have a karmic connection with them, we could say that that might be of something. We don't know. But certainly if you're Buddha, you've got the power to be able to benefit. Yeah, no.
This seems extreme.
Yes.
I mean, I have a few people, but I think, well, is it like you having your tails around? Is it like humility?
Yes, yes.
And what did the Buddha actually say?
Well, if we look at the descriptions of the hell realms, that's from the Buddha. And usually when you hear the, like the Tibetan lamas talking about it, they talk about it as psychological states, not as places. Right?
See, that's what I find. I mean, I can relate to the psychological.
Yeah, yeah. But I mean, when you get to the animal realm and the human realm, we can say, yes, there's psychological states involved, but we do see animals.
But there also seems as well that these things are supposed to be actually physical places.
Physical experiences, not necessarily a place. It's not like heaven's up there, hell's down there.
Yeah, it's like I can't quite.
I know.
Like they're so
Yeah,
specific.
Yeah.
You know, like it seems like it's a like there's a sense of almost embodiment, or at least trying to tell. But also like this embodiment, especially things like thirst.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I mean, I'd be much happier if it was like psychological, because I can relate to that. I can't relate so much to like, it seems, you know, like, but that even compared to all the fires.
Yeah,
and
yeah,
all the-
yeah.
Do you understand? What
I
I'm
do
saying?
understand.
So I can't quite bring
No, I mean,
that together.
I think the scale of it, sometimes I say the scale of it is to terrify us.
Well, I wonder, I mean,
yeah,
that's why I kind
the
of
function
know,
of it.
like-
The function of it is to terrify us. But, you know,
which I feel really pissed off about, actually.
Careful, careful, be careful. I know.
Well, I don't want. I want the truth, you know.
Well, the Buddha spoke the truth. The Buddha said, if you can disprove any of this, go ahead. You know, don't take what I said for granted. But because we can't remember our past lives, we've been in all of those realms of existence. We've done everything, but we can't remember that. But we, you know, when we suffer intense psychological episodes of whatever kind, and maybe whole lifetimes, we see that happening more and more in the world. We can say, well, we can see the consequences. Again, some karmic explanation for that in terms of like, maybe not the hot hells, but certainly this world warming up, right?
Yes.
Yeah, global warming. It's like, well, that's a result of human, predominantly human actions in this world, and not just not looking after the environment. You know, the Golden Light Sutra, where the Buddha predicted if the leaders of the land allow criminality, crops will cease to grow. There will be droughts, there will be, you know, all these consequences that we could sort of say, well, that's what's happening in the world. Of course, it was kings at that time, but it's basically saying world leaders allowing unethical behaviour. And as we see today, even those world leaders are the proponents of that unethical behaviour. So it becomes, well, we're not quite a lawless society yet, but we're in that time of more and more degeneration, seeing those environmental results, karma, but we don't think about it as karmic consequence. I mean, generally.
This made the connection, actually. It's all my Christianity background.
Yes.
Like hell and brimstone.
Yeah, hellfire, brimstone. We're always threatened with that. Yes, to terrify you. Yes.
Yeah. So it's that. I don't want to go. I don't want to have that component of my spiritual life, to be honest.
I know. I remember growing up Christian as well, and going, you know, when they said I had original sin, I was just like, well, that's not fair. I haven't done anything. But then I met Buddhism, and it was all about all these karmic consequences of things you've done in the past. And it's like, perhaps the original sin wasn't so bad in a relationship. It is hard for us to get our head around, and it's hard for us to see it as not blame. You know, it's like, it's sort of like trying to, it's said to be a law of cause and effect. It's a natural law that occurs for everyone, whether you believe it or not. And it gives, in some ways, a sort of logical explanation for things that otherwise don't seem logical, which is easier to apply when we see it happening in other situations, like I mentioned, you know, like, or even in the war situation where you could have everything burnt out except your house or your car or or whatever. So how does that work? Maybe you want, how come these people were saved or their building saved or something? Because if I look at, some of the, I haven't looked at it a lot when they're shown on the news, we just don't watch things a lot, about Ukraine and where life is sort of resuming whatever level of normality. And you see, there's quite a lot that's, I wouldn't say actually untouched, but, is in good condition as well. So, yeah.
Or even an earthquake.
Yeah, the earthquake in Turkey and Syria, yeah.
Who's getting pulled out.
But that little dog that was pulled out, 6 weeks later or something. Didn't have the karma to die.
I mean, it is interesting that originally you do have those direct correlations between sin and karma in some ways, like that whole idea. And this is what I really like about Buddhism, is that it is coherently logical.
Yeah.
So again, it's this extremes that I find don't sit with me and find kind of illogical. The only way I can get my head around that, if it's actually a dimension, is in a cumulative kind of way. But I can also see that if you get into certain mental states, even mental states where you commit suicide, it's going to be really hard to get yourself out of those kinds of mental boxes, jails, whatever you want to call them, unless there are some glimmers somewhere. Or internal wisdom or from the external.
And that's that's true. But just looking at that from visiting, a forensic unit and a mental institution and hospital for some time, and so the guys that I was visiting, they were interested in Buddhism. They were interested in meditation. Could they always do it? No, but they were interested, and they'd come along. Sometimes they just say, I can't meditate this week. Can I wash your car? That's how they earn money, $20 for a car wash. You felt obliged to $20.
I guess you can say that seed thing.
Yeah, I mean, and even, that's right. But they had also the psychiatrist there, who was actually, I think it was the psychiatrist that we ever went there, because he liked Lama Yeshe. He wasn't Buddhist, but he liked Lama Yeshe, and bring guys books and so forth. But even when we were there meditating, and there was a guy in the next room that was a padded room, because he had no control over his mind, and consequently, unfortunately, his body. I mean, it was distressing to hear, and that was his life. That's hellish. That to me is hellish. That he had no control, no insight, could not access. I mean, there's something there, but unable to access. Yeah. So yeah, it is challenging for us to get our heads around this. But to the extent that we can at least say, well, I don't want to suffer with those sorts of things. So what's the whole point of this is I want to purify whatever I have done. Plus, I want to, as much as possible, engage in virtue from now on, so that in the future, I'm not experiencing all the suffering. I don't need to experience that I'm creating for myself. That way of thinking itself is quite profound in this world, isn't it? It's like not how the Lord thinks.
I see that. So if the mind is in the body, the mind's experience, is it possible for the mind to be in physical form?
Yes.
Human,
Yes.
but be in the realm of another?
Yes. Yes.
Physically.
Yeah. I remember one woman wrote an article about it. She was an addict and Buddhist. And so this was after she was able to work through the addiction and so forth. But what she described it, she said it was utterly the predator realm. It was constant craving. It felt like this and felt like that. And she totally related to descriptions of the Hungry Ghost realm. So
in that way, is that a way of sort of moving through those
Yeah.
lower realms?
yeah,
You know, like in a strange sort of way, it's a fortunate way to move through that realm.
well, you could say that's another way to work through it. But you know, the rarity of also getting a human being, we have to take into consideration. If you think about it, even like when the Buddha passed into parinirvana and left the human form behind, so we can also relate to the alternative interpretation that the Buddha was already enlightened and took that rebirth to show us how to get enlightened. Either way, having a human form, or we look like someone, we look at the Dalai Lama and the Buddha of compassion, taking the human form, develop, and that's what the Buddhas have said, they take the form of our teachers, So we could say, well, that's a Buddha, doesn't need to have a body, but is living in that body for our benefit, because we couldn't see the pure form and get teachings from the pure form. So it goes both ways, right? So that's why they say we don't know who's a Buddha, we don't know who's a Bodhisattva. So given heavier and heavier negative fallout, hands off everybody and everything. Yeah. It's an interesting contemplation, I think, and to find our own ways, as we're doing here in this discussion, to be able to connect with that for it to make sense. Yeah. So maybe we'll move on to look at the four opponent powers before we get too depressed. I don't want to leave everybody feeling like they're in a hell realm. Oh, good. Lead the way. So we have what we call these four opponent powers. So we look at specific remedies to counter the results of non-virtuous actions. So dealing with the result of that ripens in our rebirth, throwing karma, is purified by taking refuge and generating bodhicitta. So we're taking refuge and on the basis of the power of Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, having confidence and faith in that. So sometimes this is called the power of reliance, and the other part of that, or dependence, is the bodhicitta mind, because it's more often in relation to other sentient beings, and unfortunately for us, mostly human, because we haven't even talked about the consequences of whether it's a human or an insect. So that reliance on other sentient beings for us to develop, we can only develop our compassion, our love and kindness, and so in relation to other sentient beings. Usually our families, it's what people say, or our work colleagues, or those people in the world that we can just like, it's so difficult for me to have compassion for that one. But they're our best object of compassion, because we have to try so much harder to achieve that. It's challenging. So that's the first one is, the power of reliance, or refuge and bodhicitta, the two. Reliance on Buddha, Dharma, Sangha, reliance on other sentient beings. And the result that results in the similar cause in our experience, the causally concordant result, that we experience the results of that again and again, is purified by our regret. So the regret for whatever action that we did, yeah, even that we did without intention, still good to regret, because I would say, you know, if I killed that mosquito without any intention to kill, actually I had a little baby cockroach on the counter yesterday, and I've been moving a couple away, moving this away. Don't get burnt by the teapot. And then I thought, actually, they like warmth. It was so like, and then I looked down. Is that the little cockroach or is that a tea? There was a little cockroach and there was a tea leaf. And it's just like, did I just kill that little cockroach or was that a tea? Fortunately, I didn't kill that little cockroach. So. Yeah. So, but if I had, I'd be regretting that action even though there was no intention, because I don't want any negative karma fallout that might multiply in the meantime and become heavier. Yeah.
Sometimes I've gone to rescue a bug and take it outside, and regrettably, you know, heavy-handedness, I haven't achieved that cause. My intention was to rescue it, but it didn't go as planned. So when I have regret, it's the thinking of, I could have just left it alone and not rescued it, and it would still be carrying on. Maybe
until the next clumsy person
or whatever might come along and eat it, or you know. So sometimes you know, your best intention.
Yes, absolutely.
To plan.
Yeah, sometimes your best intention doesn't go in plan, but when we talked about being a complete karma of killing, it isn't, because your intention was very virtuous, right? So there'll be some karma from that, but you regretted it straight away. And so already you're purifying that action, right, through your regret. And now you're talking about it and we can hear that genuine regret. So samsara's got all its dilemmas. It's not easy, is it? You know, cohabitating with teeny things that you can't see.
Sorry.
Go.
We're so used to pristine environments that I think that would be a bit too fussy.
Well,
you know, like you're saying, like the bug might have just wandered off. Do you know what I mean?
Oh, true. If you leave a door open or something, encourage, you know, fly through the house.
I mean, sometimes I think it's also part of our mental thing that
we built an environment for them to inhabit.
And they seem to like us humans. They want to come in and be in the same place we are. I tell you, when I go to public toilets in shopping centres and so forth, and I always put the lid down, but I'm mindful of the fact that the next person coming in and thinking perhaps that the lid's down because it's yucky underneath the lid. But I'm putting it down in case any insects have got through all our, you know, sort of pure environmental attempts to keep them outside, and that they might drown, you know. So I don't want them to drown. So, but I'm always like, who comes in next is going to be like, you know. Anyway, if they do, they do. I assure you. Oh, but that's enough information. I shall need to go on. I don't think I need to go on. All right. So, and then dealing with the result in that we continue to do that action again in our future rebirth. So, continue those actions is purified by our resolve not to do the action again. So, when we engage in purification practices, we take refuge, we generate bodhicitta, we generate a mind of regret. And so the stronger the regret, the greater the purification. Then we engage in whatever activity of purification that we're employing as the remedy. And then making the resolve is like when we, is to we can think as we're doing that when we resolve at the end. So you might not say, I'll never kill another insect when I'm trying to escort it out into, but I will have no intention to do that. And so that would be our resolve. I have no intention ever to do that. Does that mean it won't happen? We don't know, but my intention's good. Or, I will get more mindful of the teeny tiny little things, or more skillful in the ways to be able to detect them. At least while I'm sitting here, hopefully, can't even say I'm not killing any insects. But, the intention is there. So we make that, and that purifies us from being, doing those actions again in the future. So that'll be, good. And then dealing with the results that ripens in the environment we find ourselves in is purified by the practices that we do, reciting mantras, doing prostrations. Here in our text, we have the Vajrasattva practice, for example. So there are many, many different ways that we look at the actual remedy that we apply. In other words, the practice that we apply. Okay, so I'm just looking time-wise. We may not have time to go through all these practices. But here's a quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. Let's just remind ourselves of the incredible transforming energy of bodhicitta. Like the best alchemy creates gold, bodhicitta transforms this impure body we have taken into the priceless holy body of the victorious Buddha. Therefore, keep that which is called bodhicitta most stable. So, developing our love, developing our kindness, compassion towards other sentient beings, not bearing to see their suffering, even we haven't done anything yet, is the cause for us to purify what we say, these impure aggregates, and transform our body into eventually being that of a Buddha body, a pure form. Right? Meanwhile, engaging in these, the remedies, the practices that we apply is purifying our mind. So eventually we achieve the wisdom, truth body, Dharmakaya of a Buddha. So we're acting on both at the same time. So, for all our purification practices, that action of bodhicitta, which is in relation to other sentient beings, is absolutely necessary. Otherwise, we wouldn't get anywhere. So that's a core of our practice. And just talking about a bit more about the power of regret is about us actually being aware of the habits of our mind, noticing the habits of our mind. Ideally, even before we take the action, that's eventually where we want to get to. And so we shine that light of awareness there. So in our outline here, the practice of mindfulness, checking up on the effects, of our thinking, our ways of thinking. Like, for example, getting annoyed, or I can't remember the word you used to, getting annoyed. I remember reading Pabonka Rinpoche, Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand, and I'm going, that's not fair. I'm like, whoop, be careful. You're just creating some negative karma. Let go. So being able to see that in the mind and intervene as quickly as we can. And so seeing how our mind is influenced by different mental states in any moment. And how those unwholesome thoughts or toxic emotions really create more suffering for ourselves. So just another example, I remember, sometimes, it said this is a karmic thing too, that I was in San Francisco at the center and I was being introduced to this couple who were long-term supporters of our centers, and so like very long-term, they met the lamas early on. And I had some aversion arise in my mind, and I was sort of shocked. Glad I was shocked, because I was just like, drop that. And actually they became good friends. Why did that arise? Probably some past karma. Fortunately, it ripened in just that small way, and was able to, like, sort of feels like you shift your mind out of that into a more wholesome state. So the more that we're able to do that, the less regrettable actions we engage in. And so that's, part of our training when we practice mindfulness, particularly this one of noticing the thoughts and just recognizing it's just a thought, it's just a thought. And so because we're so habituated to, from eons of whether it's a tendency towards anger or jealousy or pride or whatever it is, to be able to notice that and nip it in the bud before it comes with any karmic fallout, is part of the way of training our minds. Okay. So I think we'll leave it there for today. Any last comments, questions? And next time we'll actually give time to the actual purification practices, but at least here we can see we don't have to stay stuck. There are ways out of anything, as the Buddha said. There's nothing that can't be purified, nothing, even the worst thing. So maybe just to share this one. I was at the sort of Sakyadita gathering, our picnic breakfast this morning, and we had a speaker who works in palliative care. And so she says that, she gets to hear almost, we would say, people's confessions, sometimes that they open up about things that are on their mind. And of course, they're in the state of dying or knowing that they're not going to be living very long. And so this woman who'd carried this for 50 odd years and hadn't told anyone, her immediate family knew. It's a tragic situation where she had run over her 2-year-old who died, and that she had lived with the grief of that and internalized that. And so she was able to talk about it. And because she said, I never found out if he actually suffered like, and so she said, I never found that out. And so she was able to get that resolved for her, that indeed it was an instant death. She was able to follow up with the authorities and so forth, and be able to bring her mind to some sort of relief and release around that. We would say purify your mind from that, in that situation. So to be able to do those sorts of things before we die and not have them gripping our mind is really what purification is about. All right, so we can dedicate from today all our positive energies to grow and grow, get stronger, virtuous states of mind. Page 16, third paragraph. Through the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the precious body mind, not yet born, arise and grow. May that born have no decline, but increase forevermore. On page 19, all my prayers for His Holiness. The wish-granting, wish-fulfilling jewel, source of every single benefit and happiness in this world, to the incomparably kind Tenzin Gyatso, I beseech, may all your holy wishes be spontaneously fulfilled. Page 22. You who uphold the subduer's moral way, who serves as a bountiful bearer of all, sustaining, preserving, and spreading Manjana's victorious doctrine, who masterfully accomplishes magnificent prayers honoring the three jewels, Saviour of myself and others, your disciples, please, please live long. Lord of Dharma, who in accordance with the various dispositions of those to be subdued, makes clear in the light of your well-spoken advice the sacred Ganden tradition, essence of Buddha's teachings, O foremost and holy Lama, to you for us supreme. O Lama, please, please live long. Okay, so we're having a, I think, 3-week break because we've got 2 weeks I'll be away in Bunbury. In that time, Geshe Sharab will be joining us down there and then coming up here and teaching here over that weekend on the Heart Sutra. And just to mention, if anyone's interested on the Saturday down there in Bunbury, Geshe will be teaching on Lama Tsongkhapa Guru Yoga, and at the end, I think at 3 p.m, I think we've advertised it, that Geshe is accepted to offer Bodhisattva vows. So if anybody wants to take that opportunity, it's not that long a drive down the road. Do it quite frequently. So yeah, but of course then Geshe will be here. So no doubt there will be requests for people to help out, and it's a great opportunity to help out the visit of such a precious teacher. So, and of course we have the great fortune that Geshe teaches in English, and so understands us very well.